So this is our final virtual session before the in-person session in July. We're working on sort of digital data ethics, dissemination, and co-creation. Whoops, hang on. Let's get our slides going forward. Okay. Um, so this is our agenda for the day. We plan on starting off with a relatively short 30-minute presentation of some information, some ideas. There are a few of us who will get to speak and present. And then we're going to ask you all to break out into your individual teams so that you get to have 30 minutes talking with, within your groups, where you'll essentially get to choose which of the kind of main ideas that we're covering today is really the best one for you all to tackle today, with the main idea being that we, would like you to be developing some, steps forward, some real action items, and making real progress on your projects with the time that we're spending today. And then we will come back together, and really the meat of this session will be this communal brainstorming session with everybody to identify shared issues, work towards some best practices. We'll talk about how we're going to do that. But at that point during the brainstorming session, James has some big slides that will hopefully kind of replicate a big whiteboard for all of us as we share our ideas. And then we are leaving 15 minutes at the end of our time together for a Q&A session about things going forward, especially with some of the details for those of you who are coming to the in-person session. The presentation that we have today has a lot of links in it, a lot of resources for you. And so James is going to add into the chat a link to a PDF version of these slides, so you're welcome to follow along with them yourselves. That'll just make those links more easily accessible if you'd like to look at some of them kind of as we're talking. Okay. All righty. Okay. Great. Okay. So we want to frame the session today very much as a brainstorming session, more than being about content delivery, right? This is not really a how-to session today, but rather a chance for this collective group, this sort of wonderful group of deep mapping practitioners that we've assembled for our institute, to work together to go through some of the kind of gray area related to the ethics of digital data and deep mapping. Many of the important ethical and practical questions that we're raising today are not fully answered in published literature or in best practices guides. We're operating in some pretty new territory here. So we're really hoping that together, collectively, we can work towards a roadmap, identifying some best practices or guidelines or whatever we might want to call them for digital data in deep mapping. This really seems like an area where we have the potential and really in some ways the obligation to contribute to the field. And so this session today, we hope, is a step in that direction. We've also set aside some time on July 15th, one of the last days that we're together for those of you who are coming in person, to further build on the kinds of things that we're going to set out today. The content of this session obviously is coming from many years of conversations between the co-directors, many of our colleagues, many of you on the, in the group. But we sort of put together these slides in conversations with me and Krista, and that Krista and I had with Sabrina from Calgary, who's going to lend her voice to some of the presentation today also. Okay. All right. So if we think back to the session that we did on community and ethics that Krista and Mark were running a few months ago, we were talking about working with communities, and we talked about establishing trust with community groups and building projects that maintain that trust over time. And our big mantra was do no harm, right? So we want to build on that today, but now think about it specifically having to do with data. So we can ask some of the same questions, but it might be more like, what might be the potential consequences and inadvertent impacts of the data in your deep map, right? What might be long-term impacts of that data in your deep map on communities and stakeholders? What might the data or data structures that you're building in your deep map, how could they potentially be used by someone to harm communities? And as we're thinking through those questions, we want to think about how to do more harm, but we also want to think about how can we actually do better, right? Not just do no harm, but how can we do better? Well, what does that mean? Of course, there are multiple kinds of approaches that have been and are being developed in all of our various fields and adjacent fields recently that we can draw from. And at first glance, it might seem that questions of digital data and how we arrange and store and share digital data may seem really technical. It might seem somewhat irrelevant to issues of colonial appropriation or systemic racism, but of course they're not. And so just at the risk of stating the obvious here, much of the damage of colonial structures is done by disconnecting people and groups from controlling their own information, or by preventing people and groups from controlling how and when their information is shared. And this is information like their identities, memories, histories, sacred places, sacred objects, cultural practices, and others. So as deep maps collect and connect and share really exactly that kind of information, doing no harm would mean not creating that disconnection, but also doing better would mean creating empowerment, some kind of empowerment in its place. So really the key term today is data sovereignty, right? Which can be defined as a sort of a paraphrase from a publication. The rights of an individual or group to control and maintain their own data and or data that represents them, including collection, storage, and interpretation of that data. And obviously this is a concept that's relevant for all people and all groups. There has been, though, quite a lot published specifically about indigenous data sovereignty. It's developed a recognized acronym of IDS, which in some ways can be seen as an outcome or an application of decolonization work and scholarship. And policies toward creating IDS are quite a bit more robust in Canada than in the United States. And so we're going to get to hear from Sabrina about some of her work in the Canadian context. There are quite a lot of publications about IDS specifically in the Canadian context, which can serve as great models for all of us, really. I do have a link in this slide to just a reminder that on the CDMI website, there's a resources page, and there's a section on ethics and best practices that has some of these publications for your reference. Some more robust thinking about data sovereignty and about IDS specifically are coming about in the United States. IRB offices at some universities are developing different processes for IDS. There's, for instance, there's an NSF-funded initiative called CBICS, or the Center for Braiding Indigenous Knowledge in Science. So some of this is happening, but what is happening in Canada can be a great model for many of us. So I'm going to turn this over to Sabrina. I should be able to just advance slides whenever you'd like, Sabrina, but you should be able to just speak up.
That's great. If you want to start advancing the slide, that would be great. So I do want to preface this, and I'll come back to this at the end, that while Canada has really put data sovereignty and kind of issues of research and data management to the forefront, it is by no means a ideal or perfect system, and we can talk a little bit about the reasons why. But I guess I just want to give an overview, certainly at what it might look like to have a process that encourages data sovereignty actually built into a federal government-led research funding structure. So I wanted to spend a couple of minutes just talking about where is digital data ethics and kind of digital data and data in general built into the Canadian research process. So of course, the most fundamental base, which is true for all of us, is that individual researchers have to think about data and data management and futures as we do our research, and a lot of what we do comes from our previous experiences. But there's a lot of interesting other kind of governmental level approaches to data that have become pretty standard in the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years that are kind of an interesting model or a provocation for how we might think about data ethics. So I guess I want to start at the sort of top level, top scale, like kind of federal granting requirements. Most of our funding comes from federal agencies. We have the Canadian version of the kind of NSF is, we call it the tri-agency, and it has a body, the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council of Canada, which we call SSHRC, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, NSERC, and then CIHR, which is the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. These three bodies fund the majority of research that's done in Canada. Now, there are federal granting requirements related to data. So everybody has to do this, no matter what body you apply to, no matter what your project. Anybody who is the recipient of a grant, or is a trainee that's part of a grant, or even a collaborator that is a part of a grant, they must complete what we call the TCPS2, the Tri-Council Policy Statement, mandatory training tutorial, and I've put a link to it. Anybody can complete it. It's a free online module that has people think about research ethics, and it's created really specifically towards an interdisciplinary context, any kind of researchers. And a big chunk of that is actually thinking about data. And I think you'll see a little in a few minutes about why data has become a prominent part of federal research structures. 2 years ago, the federal government actually introduced that if you have any federal money in addition to all of your other application materials, every project must make it what they call a mandatory data management plan. And I put a link to it if that's something you're interested in, that thinks about how data is collected, stored, but then also short-term and long-term questions surrounding the data. You can't even submit an application without this data management plans, and these data management plans are being assessed as a part of the competitive grant getting process. So one of the big reasons why all of these things have been introduced, and specifically individual data management plans, is that the federal government in the last 5 years has really taken a big approach to data and shifted away from the kind of open data science model that was very popular in the past, like all data should be available online to the public, to this phrase that you'll find now more than any other phrase on government websites, and that's data is contextual. So there's a real focus on recognizing the contextuality of the data collection, of the communities where data collecting is happening, and that the future stewardship, ownership of that data is not necessarily a clear one, and not all data should be open and publicly available. There's this idea that federally funded data is not necessarily a public good, which is a pretty big shift in our context over the past 5 years. Now, in addition to the federal government, we also have granting requirements at other different governmental levels. So if you do any work in the territories, in the northern territories of Canada, the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, or in Nunavut, there are territorial data requirements. So data management and thinking about data is actually subject to the modern treaties. So we have 26 modern treaties or comprehensive land claims agreements that have been signed since 1992 in Canada, which are nation-to-nation agreements between Indigenous nations and the government, or really between the crown with and nations, with the Canadian government as kind of the step in for the crown. And so one of the things that's really interesting about these modern treaties is that questions around data sovereignty are actually built into the land claims. So I put this statement from the Joint Advisory Committee on Fiscal Relations, which kind of was a part of, has been and is a part of the negotiators for modern day treaties. They write data sovereignty is an element of self-determination and self-government. Access to data and information about a nation's citizens, lands, waters, economies, natural resources is critical to good governance and sustainable development. So there's an increasing recognition that data sovereignty is not just about the data itself, about communities itself, but it is a question of government and of actual national sovereignty in the broad sense of nation. If you can just skip to the next slide. Um, One of the big reasons data became such a big focus in modern treaty negotiations here is that in the 1970s, parallel to the American Indian movement, Canada had a really big both Indigenous nationalists, but also Indigenous self-determination movement asking for renegotiation of treaties. And research and concerns about research being done on Indigenous people and on Indigenous lands without consent actually was a big part of this activist movement, like it was in the United States. So kind of in a parallel to maybe some of you are familiar with Vine Deloria's Indians and Anthropologists essay, the Yukon Native Brotherhood in 1973 released this really seminal document, Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow, which laid out a lot of the demands for treaty negotiation. And there's actually a whole section in there about research and why research, and in particular, some of the things that we think about with data is really important to understand as a part of governance and data ownership and control. So I kind of put in a box a little bit of a to draw your attention to the fact that ownership of data became something to be contested and negotiated as a part of land claims, and understanding that having data about lands is and owning it is really critical to governance. If you can just go to the next slide, I'm going to try to wrap this up. So as part of the modern treaty system, the territories actually have their own research licensing bodies. So in addition to the federal grant you get, the ethics process you actually have to submit a research application to each of the territorial licensing bodies. And this also has to include a data management and mobilization plan and has to be approved by the Indigenous nation or nations on whose territory you will be doing research. And this was quite controversial when it was introduced because these research applications were subject to approval and had to be submitted regardless of whether you work with people or Indigenous communities or as a natural scientist. So natural scientists also have to submit these research applications. They have to have a data management plan. They have to have a mobilization plan, and communities where they're doing their research, the nation on whose traditional territory they do their research has to approve that research as well. And this has been especially critical in thinking about how a lot of the research happening in the Canadian North is really about climate change and the recognition that this has a huge impact on people who live there. If you're not in the territories, if you're working on either unceded or treaty land in the provinces, so it's subject to the Indian Act, which is a law here, there are no formal requirements for research, but a nation-specific data strategy is encouraged. And again, it's encouraged whether you're working with Indigenous communities or not, whether you're a social sciences and humanities researcher or a natural sciences, engineering, health researcher. Um, as a result of the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, the federal government has also funded the First Nations Information Governance Center, which is an organization dedicated to actually outlining the legal and best practices associated with data management. And they developed this training called OCAP training, which is specific to data and specific to working with First Nations. Um, yeah, OCAP stands for ownership, control, access, and possession, and getting people to think about each of those things as separate from one another. And in many ways, OCAP has become kind of the gold standard for social science and humanities researchers, and it's provoked a lot of conversations outside of Indigenous communities, also amongst researchers who work in non-Indigenous communities, in the sense of why aren't we thinking about ownership, control, access, possession in non-Indigenous communities as well, that these are really useful concepts to prevent harm and to do better in other communities. And this is in addition to FAIR and to CARE, which you'll hear about today. And just the last slide. And of course, there's also university and institutional approaches. A lot of our trainees do have professional skills classes or requirements where they cover things like ethics and data management. We have, of course, the Research Ethics Board, which, of course, you can't even submit an application to the ethics boards without completing the tri-agency ethical online course, which I discussed earlier. We have a lot of support seminars and mobilization through our Research Ethics Board, and we have a dedicated Indigenous research support team that works with people to kind of navigate a lot of the issues surrounding data sovereignty. And our applications, of course, cover all phases of data from collection to disposal. One of the other interesting points that I think is a point of difference between Canada and the United States, and a lot of places actually, is that in social sciences and humanities research, we are encouraged to destroy primary data completely after 5 years. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is, I think, the primary one, the recognition that our data, if we're working with people, is not really ours. And we shouldn't be keeping data around in our offices or on our computers forever. So we actually have to justify if we want to keep data beyond 5 years and provide a reasoning why. Of course, if it's a longitudinal study or whatever. But then the second thing is also a concern about data ending up in and being used in ways for which it was not intended to be used, especially posthumously. And we've had quite a few, as in the US, problematic incidents with that, especially with health data. So we're really strongly encouraged to destroy data, and we have to actually provide a justification if we want to keep it. And we do have specific application sections that open up in our online system for Indigenous data and working with Indigenous community data, which includes requiring things like community approvals, data management plans, how OCAP will be applied. Very often, as you'll hear about later today, we do sign research agreements that actually detail these data management practices, and these are negotiated both with nations and also approved by legal at our universities. I'm really happy to share any resources, applications, sample research agreements. Please reach out to me if any of this interests you. And I guess I'll just end off, does everyone follow these guidelines? Well, it's quite... That's a complicated question. I think everybody aspires to. But one of the things you've seen from this conversation is, or this exposition, is that we have kind of developed quite a bureaucratic system. So this is always one of the kind of negatives that a lot of detractors of this talk about, is that now we have to be accountable to every level of government. We have to be accountable to people with whom we're not doing research. We have to do 3 applications instead of 1. There's a lot of folks who question the bureaucratization of this process, even questioning whether the bureaucratization of data management and data sovereignty takes away from the meaningfulness of it. But I think that these are generally have been really positive things and really positive for social sciences and humanities research and for communities that we work with. And I'm happy to chat more about it. But yeah, that's what I got.
Awesome. Thank you, Sabrina. I'll just say the next two slides that we have are about the care and share or care and fair approaches. This is the next one that are rubrics and sort of frameworks that have been developed by data scientists. So there are a lot of resources there that I think we'll leave for people to explore as the conversation goes on. But I think I'm turning this over to Krista.
Yeah, and just really quickly on the fair and care front,
Back
there's
one.
a handout in the folder that you were provided today that does a great job of tying the two together. And I think there's a nice little slogan like "Be fair and care." But these acronyms are really important, and I won't go into it, but in great detail, the FAIR principles are the FAIR principles are really technical driven. They're meant to center around organizing data and managing data in ways that support the computational processes, whereas the CARE principles support well they come out of and are related to indigenous data sovereignty. So really support the ideas of indigenous data governance, but in that regard, they're very much people and purpose focused, and they acknowledge the power differentials that are baked into different data sets and their creation and their use and their dissemination. So FAIR and CARE are both really essential for thinking through data management and thinking through data ethics. And we're kind of throwing around both of those terms today, data management and data ethics, but they're really two principles on different sides of the same coin. You really can't think of one without considering the other. So that's care and fair in a nutshell, but let's move on in the interest of time. We have organized our breakout session today and our brainstorming returns group discussion around four different components of data management and data ethics that we'd like to talk through a little bit, and then we'll ask you to think through. So I will talk to you for a minute about acquiring and working with data, and then Sarah will go back to sharing and maintaining data. So we can go to the next slide. By now, I really hope, and we in fact know that all of you have been very busy over the past several months acquiring your data and following the different ethical principles, some of which we mentioned a few months ago in the workshop, that have to do with ownership of data, transparency, where is it coming from, how's it being used, thinking about coding and displaying data so that it protects individual and group privacy, being clear with your partners, your community partners and stakeholders and your other team members what the intentions of your data usage is, and considering the outcomes of displaying and disseminating data sets and the impacts, inadvertent or intended, that they might have on communities and the public. In the course of data acquisition, we have been encouraging you, and we will continue to encourage you to do so, to develop research agreements with your stakeholders and partners. These research agreements are really essential for furthering transparency and building and sustaining workable relationships when it comes to charting the course of the project, but also those moments where we are kind of wading through the gray area of who owns this information, who gets to disseminate it, what happens when information we collect is then transferred over into the deep map format. We've provided you, there's a link here, but also in the folder, there's some samples of research agreements that our team have had with their partners. So we would encourage you to go and have a look at that. You can go to the next slide, Sarah. We're talking a bit about, well, I'll get back to that in a second when we talk about working with data. But I think Don and Dan and James and Bob are going to be drilling into your head the idea of metadata. If you go back into the files after today's workshop and look through the FAIR principles, the acronym FAIR stands for findable data, accessible data, interoperable data, and reusable data. But the backbone of kind of fair data management practices is good metadata. So you're going to be developing robust recording and data entry systems that capture information about the provenance, the source, the data type, spatial locations, and descriptions of your data that really support the ideas of sustainability and transparency and reusability that are the best practices that exist right now, but also will be reflected in your data management plans and your data management agreements. So the Kiwana Time Traveler project has a great data management plan. The example is linked here. It's also in the shared folder. And it's kind of technical and complicated how the data is collected and maintained, but it's spelled out in great detail there. And as Sabrina mentioned, it is the case too in the US now that almost every funding application that has to do with projects that might align with the digital humanities or deep mapping requires a data management plan as well. So these aren't just necessary for you to think through within the isolated space of your current deep map, but with whatever project you intend to build out from the deep maps or necessary for thinking through when you go to submit for funding for your project. All right, let's go into the next one. When it comes to working with data, we're getting into a whole bundle of issues that we really don't have time to unpack individually today, but these should be things that you're already thinking of, are in the back of our minds, and are really concrete and logistical questions and steps that you should be taking as you ready your data for digitization, uploading, and transformation. So the most obvious, and we kind of touched upon this in the last workshop briefly, is copyright and fair use. Obviously, using copyrighted material requires permission, and also the way in which copyright law works is going to vary from country to country. So in the US, for example, if you're working with information, copyrighted information that is less than 100 years old, it may not necessarily be fair use automatically, but there may be some gray areas there in terms of gray use that if you're knowledgeable about them, you can take advantage of in justifying the decisions you're making for working with data in your deep map. So for example, in the context of this US copyright fair use law, you can use copyrighted material that is less than 100 years old, so 1926 to the present. You can use it in the context of research and educational projects without having to go through the extra hoops of procuring copyright permissions, especially if you're using it in a transformative process, if you're transforming it sufficiently under the terms of fair use copyright law. And that, what does that mean? You know, it sounds a little bit legalese, I realize that, but it means not only physically transforming it, but adding new layers of value and information and meaning to it in the course of your mapping project. And this falls under the reuse component of the FAIR principle that we already mentioned. So in the Kiwana Time Traveler example that you're seeing here, but also in the Hamtramck Explorer and pretty much every project, our deep mapping project, our team members have worked with, we accept the transformative process, an example of it to be when we take a Sanborn map, stitch them together, do the work of georeferencing the different buildings and landscapes on them, and then combining those individual stitched Sanborn files with other maps and linking them to other data sources. So that process is transformative. for the purpose of creating the deep map, which is a research and educational tool. So I hope that kind of makes sense. It's a roundabout way of describing, but this isn't really us justifying why we're doing what we're doing and not having to go through copyright permissions. It is truly transformative, and it shows a way in which we're thinking through different permission and other requirements. You can go to the next one. There's a whole other bundle of permissions and conversations to be had when we're talking about working with data in terms of ownership. I realize it says copyright and fair use here, but it really should just say ownership, because this isn't so much about working with copyrighted data, but working with data that becomes modified in the course of its creation. So an example here might be a two-dimensional photograph of an archaeological object or other information from an archaeological context, and or a set of those photos that gets transformed into a 3D model. Here you're looking at an image of a 3D model of a floorboard that was excavated from the old Hamtramck Center firehouse. So what happens when somebody takes the time and makes the editorial decisions to create a 3D model of an object or a building, an architectural rendering, or they do photogrammetry on an archaeological feature or museum object? Many people have touched the digital files and modified them in different ways in the course of their creation. And this is what Sarah and I kind of meant by the word co-creation that you've seen on a few of the slides and also in the title of today's workshop. And as we got to thinking about how we were going to talk about the kind of working with co-created data, we got a bit theoretical, and we started to ask each other, what isn't co-created when you're working with the deep map? There's a lot of hands a lot of cooks in the kitchen, a lot of hands in the digital pie. So what does that mean when it comes to ownership, not just of the materials within the project team, but say, for example, you have an artifact from an excavated context or a museum context, and an artist creates their own rendering of that, and you want to put the artistic rendering in your digital deep map. I think, Sabrina, you had an example of a belt buckle we talked about that inspired us along these ways too. We don't have to go into the details of that, but anyway, all this is to say these are complicated questions, and they need to be dealt with and accounted for in the research agreement, in the data management plan. So if you want to bring art into your project, artworks into your project that are based on or rooted in or linked to some of the maps or objects or stories that are in your digital deep map, you need to be accountable for them and how that ownership is going to be credited, transferred, recognized, reproduced, and so on. Do we have another slide there? I'm not sure. It's over to you, Sarah. Yeah.
Thanks, Krista. So this brings us to kind of the third topic of sharing and communicating data, right? Some of these issues came up in our last session, working on data linkages. So, some data obviously requires consideration because it's sensitive personal data. Surprisingly, the guidelines in the US, at least, are not terribly strict or clear about this. This could include identifiable data, info of a sensitive nature about health or finances. So you'll want to be thinking, if there's sensitive information that you want to be careful about. An example that we've encountered and worked through with the QAnon Time Traveler team comes from the creation of what was called the Copper Miners Employee Card Database. So this was actually a project funded by the Council on Library and Information Resources that we worked on with our university archive. We were digitizing and creating metadata and making public about 40,000 employee cards from the biggest local mining company, created an image database online, which is what you're seeing, and then the records were also linked and mapped in the QAnon Time Traveler. Most of the information in the cards was from 1890 to World War I, but some of it went later. And so there were two kinds of data that we were concerned about. One was that about 15% of the cards had Social Security numbers on them because they were working after the Social Security Act of 1935. So and then also there was some information about people who were probably still alive. So for the Social Security numbers, we did not collect that information as part of the metadata at all. And we're not making images of those cards available at all. For information that was more recent than 72 years, we embargo the images of those cards until they are less than 72 years. So every 2 years or so now, we go through and make available cards that are now older than 72 years. And we used that 72-year kind of rule of thumb, which is the basis that the US Census Bureau uses and has become the real de facto kind of acceptable standard in archival practice. And we really worked with the program officers at CLEAR when we were writing this grant to work through these issues. The sample of that plan is available to you. We did write it in 2019, which does seem old at this point. So another topic in in the sharing and communicating, how do we let users, public users, know where all of this data comes from? You know, for all of their power and advantages, HSDIs do make the sources of data somewhat opaque, especially to sort of new public users, and it's our job to provide, you know, sort of accurate and accessible information about where they come from. So many of you remember, or, you know, in using the Time Traveler, you know that in the full details panel, when you roll over a piece of information, the little pop-up shows up to tell you where it comes from. And then there's a link at the bottom that takes you to the about data page, about the data pages of the Time Traveler's website, where there's lots and lots of in-depth information about where that comes from. Another issue is about the precision of the data, and this is partly what a lot of us were talking about in our last session. You know, we use the time slice approach, so we're putting maps and data together that were maybe not made in exactly the same year. And so how do we make those details clear to people? You know, again, it shows up in those pop-ups, and people can dig in to the about data page to understand that. Other questions about sort of certainty or uncertainty in the data relate to place, right? Remember when Dan was telling us about data linkages a few weeks ago, he was explaining about how in the Time Traveler, we've used 4 different levels of places that we mapped people to: their houses, their streets, their blocks, or their enumeration districts. But how do we communicate that to people? Well, again, you know, we use, you know, approximate in the drop-down menu for people exploring that data, so that when they encounter 400 people lumped together in what looks like the middle of the woods because it's the enumeration district, that's how we try to make that clear. Lastly, we also recognize the need to differentiate between what we might call curated data and user-contributed data. So when we go to talk about the Time Traveler with public groups, we often have people raise their hand and they're asking about the user-contributed stories, and they'll say, well, what happens if someone submits a story that's not true, right? And, you know, there are lots of layers in that question. One is, you know, maybe a kind of outdated idea that history comes from experts and is actual truth, right? And that's sort of a whole other topic to discuss. But what people are really asking about is they want to know about the difference between these different kinds of data that are in here. So we respond usually by explaining to people, well, if you have a different version of that story or that place or that event, share it. And you can share your own story right in the same location. You could start a conversation on our social media platforms. But that's how we're creating this multivocal representation of past places. This is just a reminder that we, in our About Data section on the website, we have different levels of information, sort of The behind the scenes is for maybe you all, colleagues, professionals interested in deep mapping. And then also we have tried to arrange that in a way that's available to public users and accessible to public users also. So
Cool.
for managing data, it's heading to
Yes,
Krista.
yeah. So, okay, this is our last slide before we get ready to break our last two slides before we get ready to break out into discussions. But this is really teeing up our discussion, and a lot of this has been touched on already. When it comes to a data management plan and a sustainability plan aren't necessarily the same things. Data management plans are often created for funders when you're putting together a project application or grant submission, and it tells the technical details about how the data will be stored on a server and how it will be maintained and updated over time and so on and so forth. It could have a sustainability component to it, but a sustainability plan is also oriented to the future. Who's going to do the work of the maintaining? How long is this project going to continue to be? How long is DeepMap going to be continually updated and upgraded and so on and so forth? So have a look at those two. The fact of the matter is, and I'll kind of truncate this because of we want to make sure you have time for your discussions, but the fact of the matter is that digital data degrades over time. There's no way around the fact that file formats change, technologies change, computing power changes. We're on the brink of a AI machine learning revolution here that's not necessarily going to transform deep mapping right away because of the human element in that. But we need to be, again, transparent, going back to some of our principles that we introduced about the fact that data degrades. So when we're talking to our partners, I think there's a necessity to maybe temper expectations that a digital deep map will A, last forever, and B, do all the things, all the technological wizardry that we hope it will do. I mean, that was very much, I'm guilty of this myself. That was very much the kind of enthusiasm undergirding the digital humanities movement when it emerged, 10, 15 years ago. But if those of you that were involved with digital humanities projects a decade or more ago, think about how much the digital world has changed just in the space of a decade. Where will we be a decade from now? It's really hard to plan out when it comes to digital projects and sustainability and projecting into the future. So I can't see all of your faces, but I wonder how many of you had a sort of visceral, visible reaction when you heard Sabrina say that in Canada they're encouraged to destroy data after 5 years that they've collected. That's not necessarily the case for digital deep maps. It could be, but it does raise the question. It does beg the question. And one of the options for today's discussion asks you to think of this with your team. Should we be choosing a time horizon for our digital deep map project data collection? So, we see these deep maps as important digital preservation tools, and they can be for a very long time. They can be archived. But how long do you plan to have your digital deep map run as an open access collecting tool, an additive tool? 5 years, 10 years, forever and ever. I think the majority of us went into these projects thinking, oh, we'll do this forever. It'll be great. We'll get as much information as we can. But then what? Right? How do we keep up with that over time? So the good news, this is sort of like, I don't want to bring everybody down. The good news is that, as you can see from the points on the slide here, the HSDI, the infrastructure, actually helps address some aspects of digital sustainability over time. And you can see from the points here, and let's go to the next slide as well. And it helps address some of the logistics that funding agencies require. It can lengthen time horizons for data access, and the metadata that you enter as you're geocoding and creating references for your materials now is crucial for maintaining the long-term usability of your digital deep map, whether it's archived or active. So these are things to think of, things to motivate you now as you enter data and go through the slog of that data entry, thinking of the implications for the long run, but it's really essential to be realistic about the time horizon for your projects. Okay, let's go to the next slide because I think it kicks off our discussion moment. Okay, so today what we're going to do is break out your groups individually. So each one of you will be with your group members. If you happen to be flying solo in your group, I didn't take stock of that, but that may be the case, and that's okay. You can work on this on your own and maybe create a Google Doc that you can share with your team members later. We have a worksheet for you. It's in the Google Drive, or you might be able to click to, oh, James has just put it in the chat. Thank you. You have a choice. This is a kind of choose your own adventure workshop moment. You can work through, there's a set of questions for each one of the 4 data management components that we just talked through. Pick one of the 4 components, work through those questions with your group. We suggest you choose the one that you're not furthest along with, but rather the one that's most pressing for your project at this moment or for the long term. If within the space of the 30 minutes that we're going to give you, you finish one component, please move on to another one. We've decided as a co-director team that we're not going to parachute into your sessions today. We want these conversations to be focused and private among your group. To the extent that you're ironing out kinks and all that. But instead of us dipping in, we would encourage you, if you have a question or want clarification, to dip out, send somebody out of the room. The rest of us will be waiting in the main lobby room, or you can send us a chat message maybe. So we are going to spend a half hour now. We'll reconvene around 2:25 or so. And then we'll have a little chat about what you and your groups talked about, but we're really going to shift the remaining discussion time towards what you think some of the best practices for data management are coming out of the discussions you have with your group, but also the ideas we've discussed in our presentation with you. So go forth and spend some time with your group. And if you can't access the worksheet, do let us know. We'll help you out. All right, looking good. I think my screen is done blinking with all of your boxes coming back. So welcome back. I hope your discussion was interesting and productive. We shortened it by a few minutes because we want to make sure we can cram everything in that we need to get covered at the end today. So what we're going to do now is Sarah is going to share a Google Docs link in the, or James just did, sorry, link in the chat to something called brainstorming notes. So we're going to do 2 things at once because you're all excellent multitaskers, but we're going to ask one person from each group to report out on just maybe 3 minutes each group on what you talked about and some of the issues or best practices that you acknowledged within the space of your one of the 4 topics that you tackled. And then we would at the same time like one or more people from your group to include some notes in the relevant slide. There's a different slide for each of the 4 components of data management. We're all going to do this at the same time, so it might look chaotic, but we're going to wrangle what you dump into these slides and reformat them later. The key thing, as James pointed out, is that you create a text box for yourself. So James, you want to
Here, I got it.
that? There you go. Make a little text box and type
If you don't use Google Slides, this here is the text box tool.
Yeah,
so
the T icon. So
yeah.
Put your comments however you want. Doesn't matter what font or bullet points or anything like that you're using. If text boxes are overlapping and they look a mess, don't worry about that. We'll reformat it later. Just don't write it. The rule is don't write in anybody else's text box. One text box per person. So if you could go ahead and write some of your notes in there, and then we'll ask each team to share with us kind of verbally what they discussed, and we'll see if we have time to come around full circle and talk bigger picture. If not, we're carrying all of this forward. We're carrying the slides forward. We're carrying the conversation forward into the in-person workshop and beyond. So go ahead, start writing. Do we have a volunteer from the crowd for who would like to report out from your group first? I can't see all of you with the
acquiring data right now.
with the screen shared. So you could just unmute yourself and say who you're reporting from.
Are you doing these in order? So based on someone who discussed acquiring data?
Not necessarily.
whoever wants
Some
to
teams
So,
may have.
well, Oklahoma, we can go real quick.
Go ahead, Oklahoma.
Because we discussed the data management one, and this is an issue that's come up with us a couple of times because we are actually two separate entities working together, collaborating. So one of them is the lead agency, which is a nonprofit organization located in Miami, Oklahoma. And then we have the University of Oklahoma team that is, of course, based at the University of Oklahoma. And each of us have our own resources available to us, but with caveats. So for instance, when we're thinking about the geospatial data, the lead agency does have access to Esri resources such as ArcGIS Online Organizational Account, but they are dependent on even a third party for that, which is something called the Riverkeeper Alliance. Whereas at the University of Oklahoma, we have institutional-wide availability, a software availability. And so coming up with a mechanism to where we can manage the data that makes sure that the lead agency has access to it as well is of utmost importance to us. And so I think, and I don't want to speak out of tune here, that our kind of compelling overriding idea is that currently, because we know that the university with its institutional license will likely be more stable, at least that's the perception, that we will maintain data on the University of Oklahoma side.
Geospatial
Yeah,
data.
geospatial data. Yes, that's the other thing I need to really make sure we're talking about here, is because we have other data sets that are not geospatial, and that becomes a whole other can of worms that we need to discuss. So for instance, oral interviews that we're conducting with different individuals, and where will those be housed? But so I'm just talking geospatial data right now. Then we went into longevity of this. Of course, all of us would like the data to live on well beyond our time working on this project and being at the university or with lead agency, et cetera. But realistically, we think that putting a 5-year timestamp on this is feasible, and that we can maintain it over that period of time. And then depending on where everyone is, then deciding what we need to do to move forward. And then I don't have the notes in front of me, so I don't remember what the last one was. There was longevity and there was one other. The sustainability plan.
Yeah.
And the simple answer to that one is no, we do not have a sustainability plan yet, but we obviously need one. And so I think that's what we ended up discussing during most of our time.
Mhm.
That's great, because that's your pressing topic. That's
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect.
Sure.
Did I miss anything? Is that a fair
No,
assessment?
thanks, Todd.
No, I
Well
think
done.
that's right.
Thanks, Team Oklahoma. Does another team want to chime in?
Charleston will go if you're
All right.
ready, willing.
Go for
So
One of you.
we tackled working with data. For us, that's going to be one of the bigger pieces we have. And so when we dig into things like copyright and fair use, this is a discussion we've had a whole lot trying to figure it out, since we're dealing directly with people here. And so our thought process on that is, of course, bring in legal from the university to help us. And we've been doing that. And then trying to figure out how to tackle it, either from like an individual by category or piece of data to maybe a blanket agreement of some kind, before you can even access anything. For data ownership, we discussed some of the issues we have there, as one of the key components is working with the settlement communities after emancipation. And they have stories to give us. They can contribute a lot of data that has not been made public at all. And so trying to figure out who owns what to use what is something we're also tackling. We've basically decided as a group to distribute that data and have it stored in its appropriate place. We're lucky to have partners, for example, like the Low Country Digital Library. So if we have digital records, it might as well include it into them for whatnot. And for more physical pieces, for example, we have the International African American Museum here, who collects things like, family records and whatnot. So they should go there. That's basically where we're at as far as that goes. You speaking in, Jim?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I would also say it's like something that they came up in our conversation was looking to International African American Museum, for example, and seeing, okay, so you have acquired this information from people to kind of hold and curate this information. Does your agreement with your donors include the use that we would be doing here? So that's something that we need to talk over with our partner organizations in terms of, like, you have access to, you have this information. Is it within your rights? Do you have the right to have us use it in the way that we would like? So that's going to be a fun conversation around the table.
Yep, important one. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And so, we fall into like what's a third party use and what, all that kind of stuff. So we're tackling on that one. Ethically, ours is pretty straightforward for us. We do the whole like talk to them, ask, don't take thing. Pretty straightforward. We try to be as clear as absolutely possible about what we're doing, and we hide absolutely nothing. They ask a question, we do what we can to give it to them. And we have to also be very flexible here with the people we deal with. Ideas change, politics change. It's South Carolina, so make of that as you wish. And so we try to basically make sure we're able to be nimble. Okay, one last thing, your data linking precision. This is something we're all trying to get better at. For us, we be as transparent as we can, especially when data becomes contextual. That's how it goes. And for a lot of things we're going to have to deal with is the transition from slavery to emancipation. And there is concerns in the community about, for example, who owned human beings and are they still here? Because the answer is yes, those families are still here. And so those are some of the things we're currently trying to get with our data linking all taken care of. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Team Charleston. Another team want to report out?
May I from
Yes,
São Paulo?
of course. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. We choose to debate the communication and sharing data, and we have this specificity that the data is not fed by us but by users, not by the project team. So we don't have the control of this data. If they are, if this data have problems with copyright or ethical issues, we are very far from having an answer to deal with this. We have this concerning that the lack of information about this issue by the users themselves and potential users, and we debated that we have the need to foster this debate between us and between the users and potential users. We copied the use terms of our platform in this form to whom are interested to see. But in the other hand, we are facing just now a kind of pilot project in this, the context of this course, the pilot experience with memory collectives that we are beginning now. we think that this will facilitate this discussion and even the control of the data feeding, and this can also improve the future protocols of the platform based in this experience. We have at least 2 groups that are beginning to work with us, collective groups of São Paulo, and we are trying to expand this to 1 or more group. Regarding the communicating data sources, each layer has a sheet of information of its metadata, including authorship, references, methodology, etc. This can be improved with fields more specific, not so open, in order to force the user to give some critical information if it's the case. In terms of informing the lack of precision or uncertainty, we have our geolocator and the icon that it generates informing the location of address. It has different colors depending on the accuracy of the localization. And we had no time to discuss the third question, communicating uncertainty. What kinds of uncertainty in our data mapping are necessary to communicate? This is a fairly critical issue because anybody can upload anything from anywhere to our platform. So that question that were shown in the first part of our session today, that what happens if somebody uploads incorrect information? The answer that you gave, Sarah or Krista, now I'm not sure.
It was me, but yeah.
Okay, sorry, Sarah. The answer that you offered to this question is very suited to our case because we try to foster a sense of community, maybe through a kind of tutorship with teams or regions of the city. So the community then itself would criticize or giving suggestions to improve the layers that are on the platform. It's more or less the abstract of what we discussed. Thank you.
Thanks, Luis.
Thanks, Luis. Anybody else want to chime in? We've got about 10 minutes left for this portion. So
yeah, I see great notes on the slides.
I know,
Thanks,
it's going
everyone.
crazy. Yeah.
Awesome.
We can go really quickly, Team Dominica. We, like others seemingly, did discuss mostly share issues with sharing data. Some of these we've already been talking about a little bit because we are sort of we've acquired most of our data. And so there's a couple issues that we're kind of facing or challenges. First is that we will be incorporating oral histories, in particular, some related to sort of recent, at least people, that involves people who are still alive or direct descendants who are still living. Some political oppression and violence that happened, colonial oppression and violence in the late 20th century. And so, the question is, including those locations and the stories, of course, put people at risk, lives of people related to specifically oppressed groups in the past. And then also the current locations, sharing them. These are locations of refuge, sites of refuge in the past. So are there people that are still using these areas and that sharing these locations could potentially impact their lives and livelihoods as well. So with regard to those and sort of as Sarah and Krista both talked about, we'll be hopefully using sort of our, precision, right? So we won't be sharing specific locations, down to the, latitude and longitude. use scale to sort of help us conceal and obscure those areas so that we aren't, in terms of location, so that we aren't harming anybody in the present. And then in terms of the past, this is something we're actively working on. Of course, we use things like anonymization, right, to make sure that people aren't, we're not outing anybody's particular stories or individuals that could potentially cause them harm in the present or their families. So those are things we're kind of working through in terms of the oral history aspect of things. And then also we are going to be sharing site locations, archaeological sites, historical sites from the past. And as any archaeologist knows, right, then if you open yourselves up to the potential of looters coming into the site, destroying and endangering cultural resources, and these are also commonly on private land as well, right? So then we're talking again about lives and livelihood of individual landowners. So that's a concern of ours as well. So again, so something we're going to think about going forward, and again, thinking about the precision at which we represent these site locations. Some of them are already known publicly anyway, but this is something we'll consider going forward. We've I don't know if there's anything else. Also talked a little bit about conveying uncertainty in our data as well today. So how would we do that? And we'll include a glossary, for example, of archaeological terms that discusses sort of uncertainty that in our data regard to things like carbon-14 dating and just general archaeological data that we have uncertainty about. And also we're thinking about, how do we convey, the uncertainty in archival sources, in particular, created by colonizers and settlers of the past, and those motivations in creating these maps, right, and other registries and whatever they were, right. How do we and we make sure we're clear about, we use these, or we analyze these critically before we present them, right, and how we present them is going to be important. So those are some of the things we talked about today, unless someone else wants to raise something else.
Thank you, Diane. Sounds great. Yeah. Anybody else from Dominica, or does another team want to chime in?
From North Dakota, we obviously had some similar issues with archaeological sites, stuff like that Diane was just talking about. But a couple of things that came up for us within the sensitive information, because we're still kind of very early phases, but we might have data coming from Indigenous communities. And one of the things, he's not here with us today, but one of the things that Tyrell, one of our Indigenous members of the team, has raised is that sometimes stories should only be shared seasonally, right, at certain times of the year. So one of the things that we're trying to think through is, can you embargo or hide data, but on a seasonal basis, right? What would that look like? What would the kind of technical side of that be? Because that might be a really important feature to talk about with communities before they're even willing to start talking about research agreements and stuff like that, right? So this is something that's come up for us. Another thing is thinking through sensitive environmental data. So, right, one example for us, because we live in a place that floods very regularly, when we're talking about very specific locations, when we're talking about historic floods, what something might look like if we didn't have a diversion, how could that potentially impact people today in terms of, like, flood insurance and stuff like that. So we've got such a huge range of types of data that it feels like we have more questions right now than we have answers. So yeah.
Thank you, Kristen. We have time for another report. One of the other groups wants to chime in.
Can I give some complications as to our particular site? We're looking at a town that no longer exists, that lasted for maybe 30 years, and the property is now private property. So one of the things that we were, or recently came to mind, was how granular we want to share the locations of families who lived at this location publicly versus privately. So we may collect information. We may have it tied to the deep map as a specific location on this property. But depending on the current owners of the property, we may just say this viewpoint had these people in it and one of their last names was this, as opposed to giving really precise locations that your family was the fourth one in this particular row of houses. But the photographs that we have would be shared publicly if they are from a provincial archive, or we can get permission from and specifically an aerial photograph. If they're a photograph of a postcard from the collection, that would get shared publicly. So it really does come down to the context of the data that we have and how much detail we can actually share publicly versus collected separately, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And thinking of the different scales at which you can represent the data to ensure privacy, but also ensure some information is disseminated appropriately. Absolutely.
Yeah, and one of the things I was talking with Kim is the potential for all the geolocating that we're doing for these individual artifacts or stories or narratives that are in the special collections or the provincial archives. How can we add the geolocation that we've been able to decipher to the original record? And because if you look at your iPhone or Google phone, and when you take a picture, it's tied to a map and you can look at that map. What if you could do that with all of the records? And this may be an interesting entry point for expanding on the capabilities of much larger archives of information. So, in terms of care, that would be giving back to the original archive owner, kind of a quid pro quo.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept. And it's something we don't think of, or we do, but we haven't talked about archives as stakeholders as well. And they definitely are. Okay, I'm sorry if we didn't get to hear from your team. But I see in the shared PowerPoint that everybody's put something in, and even better that there's text entry for all 4 components. So that's great. We'll share it with you. You can continue to add text there if there was something you wanted to say in the group discussion but didn't have a chance to. So thank you for your attention to the topic of data management and ethics and co-creation today. This is just the beginning, really just the tip of the iceberg. We have a lot of work to do on this topic. And as my colleagues and I see it, this is going to be one of the major outcomes, intellectual outcomes as a collective from the Institute. So keep thinking about it. So we're going to shift gears now to a few logistical points to close on. First has to do with conferencing. Those of you that have put in abstracts to the SSHA, the Social Science History Association Conference, know that the 2 sessions that are highlighting the Institute projects has been accepted. So congratulations, that's great news. And many of you are aware, now all of you are aware that the Society for Historical Archaeology is being hosted in Detroit next January. The abstract portal is open now. Our team is going to be putting together a session about deep mapping, and we're hoping to really showcase the Institute projects. We're also going to open it up a little bit more to the listserv that we created as part of the Institute with the people that applied, but we weren't able to accept. But we really want to prioritize including any of you who want to have presentations there. Dan Treppel is going to put together the abstract for the symposium on deep mapping, and we'll circulate it to all of you by Slack at some point next week. And so once that symposium is in the SHA conference tool system, we'll, if you're interested, we'll guide you on how to create an abstract for your presentation and upload it. So hopefully several of you will be game for that. So let's go on to the next slide, and I will turn it over to Don, I think.
Yeah, I'll take it. So as we're thinking about preparing for the in-person component of the Institute, there's a few things I wanted to chat with folks about and get some feedback on. So first thing we need in preparation is I would really appreciate if we could get updated project abstracts, descriptions, kind of a 1 to 2 page kind of thing for each of the projects. Okay. We're going to be providing these to our visiting speakers and discussants. And as I've been meeting with each group, it's clear that obviously your project scopes and scales and considerations have all changed since you applied for the Institute last fall, as they should have. And so if we can get updated abstracts, that would be great. If you could send them to James by June 18th, that was sort of the date I told our speakers that we would have them. That would be wonderful. So we can send them off to them. They'll have a couple of weeks to read them, think about them, synthesize them, and that will make the most of their time with us. Okay. Oh, and Wright says, could we share the other project descriptions with all of us? Yeah, actually, I'm hoping to update the website with those as well, if everybody's okay with that. So we'll make sure everybody gets all of that. Okay. Okay. Another part is data preparation. So there's some required elements that we need you to have prepared before you come, and some are just strongly suggested. Okay. So the one that's absolutely required is that everyone is coming to the in-person component with a minimum of 2 georeferenced maps that represent the same time period, or I'm sorry, they represent the same location in at least 2 time periods. Okay. So basically 2 time slices of the same geography. Okay. We need those maps to be georeferenced and mosaicked and built into an image service. Now, if that sounds completely foreign to most of you, that's okay. The map warper instance that we built for the Institute will do all of that for you as soon as you georeference the maps. Okay, and so as a reminder, the project website, the Institute website has a link to a tutorial to use the map warper as well as how to get into it. And James, if you have a moment, maybe you could post that in your Slack or the chat again. If you're GIS savvy, you're welcome to do that on your own. If you're not ready for that yet, use Map Warper. It will create those image services, but we need those image services for your projects to use while we're here together. Okay. And so if there's questions about that, you're not sure how to do it, you run into issues, that's why we have support. We have office hours. We can help you get that moving along. So just send us a request on Slack and one of us can help you out with that. Okay. Next slide. These are encouraged. So they're not, you do not need to have these ready, but if you have them ready or any pieces of these, please bring them with you. Okay. So one would be if you have maps and a work plan for what you want. Well, you'll have some maps because you need to bring at least 2 maps anyway. But you can bring more than 2. And if you have a work plan for how you want to digitize historical features, either for geocoding, public engagement, for spatial analysis, whatever it is that you're doing in your particular project, bring those with you. Okay. And we'll have an opportunity to work with your own data. We are going to have plenty of trial sample teaching data, if we want to call it, that we're going to be using in the in-person workshops. But if you've got your own, you'll have time while you're here, as well as have the supports from all the staff here to be able to help you through working with your own data. Okay. Second to that, any tabular data set that you want to map to a historical space-time. Okay. So that could be anything that you're working with. Bring that with you. Or any 2 data sets that you would like to learn how to do record linkage, okay, across space and time. Again, we're going to be doing all these things with sort of teaching data, but if you've got your own, please bring it with you. And again, reach out for support if you need any help preparing your data before you arrive. Okay. Next one. The agenda. So very pleased to announce that Dr. Sarah Surface Evans, who is Michigan Senior Archaeologist for our SHPO, our State Historic Preservation Office, will be able to join us in person for part of the Institute. So that was kind of up in the air when we sent out the draft agenda, but she's being able to confirm and she'll be joining us. She's an expert in particular on dealing with sensitivity and ethical issues around mapping archaeological sites, traditional cultural places and landscapes, and so she'll be joining us for a couple of days. So we're really lucky to have her. The other details of the agenda are really starting to kind of be finalized, so we're super excited about that. So we will send you what looks like a final agenda pretty soon. A couple more days, middle of next week or so, I'm hoping. We'll send it to you on Slack, and we'll update the website when that's ready to go. Okay, so this is what I want to spend the last 10 minutes on or so. Preparing for your travels. This obviously is just for those of us who are coming together. We are working on putting together sort of a travel Q&A page that will be on the website, and we'll post that in Slack so you can see it when it's ready. But a few things that I've already been getting questions about from folks, so I just thought I'd bring them up here as maybe a way of getting you to think about questions that you might have that you could ask us now as a group, because we all could share from those shared questions. So yes, in July up here in the Keweenaw, it can get down to like 8 to 11 degrees centigrade in the evenings. I'm looking to my colleagues in Brazil who probably are not prepared for weather like that. So I'm encouraging you guys to recognize that you want to bring some warmer weather, because it can get cool, and we've got a lot of evening activities planned. Okay. Do bring some comfortable shoes for hiking and walking around. We're going to have a few days where we're doing a fair bit of that. Long pants, hat, sunglasses. We do have ticks here in the Keweenaw, and so we want to make sure you guys have your legs protected and stuff when we're out and about. You're welcome to bring swimwear, but know that the water is pretty cold, even in July up here. So water temperature is typically 57 to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Airport pickup drop-offs. We know when you're coming and going, so we will be picking everyone up. So we don't have Uber here or anything like that. We will be picking all of you up in combinations of our various vehicles, and we'll be dropping you off. So if something changes with your flight itineraries, please make sure you send that to James or I, so we can update that, because we'll be looking for you at the airport. And most of you are coming in on the midday flight anyway, so you'll all know each other really well, because you'll be sitting in O'Hare together, hanging out at the one gate that goes to the Keweenaw, which you'll meet half of our town while you're there. It's kind of a thing. All computing will be provided to you in the laboratory, so you don't need to bring anything. However, if you have a laptop and it's not a burden, bring it with you, just so you have it to work on during some of our work sessions that we're going to have while we're at the inn. Okay. A few have already asked, about this, and so we have, I don't know, half dozen or so that you can borrow. So if you don't have one, it's okay. But if you do, and it's easy to bring with you, do bring it with you. We'll be getting a hold of you soon, requesting cell phone numbers, just to make sure we can keep track of folks as you're out and about, pickups from drop-offs and things like that. So look for that. And with that, I guess I just want to open it up and say, other sort of travel logistical questions that you've been thinking about as you've been planning for your travel that is maybe not yet addressed here, even though we know we have lots of other things we're going to be sending you materials on, but questions while we're all together.
May I, Don?
Please.
We have a doubt. I and Luana and Mona Lisa, we are going to travel to New York, Chicago and New York after the in-person period.
Mm-hmm.
Is it easy to rent a car in Houghton up there?
You can rent a car. it can be challenging to get a car that they'll let you take out of town. So to rent a car and take it all the way to Chicago, for example, because then we never get the car back. So let me make an inquiry for you, okay, and with the local office and see if we can make those arrangements. I assume you want to take it to Chicago and drop it off there?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
We rent another car from Chicago to New York, but I think there is much easier.
That's going to be easier. Yeah. Let me, I will look into that for you, Luis, and I will send you an email, let you know. Okay?
Okay. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Right?
Yeah. I was curious if we'd be able to get the MAC address for our laptops whitelisted so we can use Ethernet while we're there in the lab. I'm just remoting into a PC at home, and didn't know how that'd work on Wi-Fi.
Well, our Wi-Fi is pretty good, especially in that building. But I will look into it.
Okay.
My hunch is no.
Right.
We have had some substantial issues with security hacking things from certain parts of the world, and so our wired network has become really locked down. But I'll look into it. So, other questions? No? Okay. Well, surely they'll come up. We're going to put the Q&A together, which will also include a lot of resources. I know folks have talked about wanting to go kayaking, wanting to go mountain biking, wanting to do some of these other sort of activities. We've got partners that can help support that. So we can, we'll give you those resources so you can make reservations, stuff like that. Also know that we will have vehicles that you can use while you're here. Okay. So, you'll be able to borrow a vehicle and go off and, do some shopping or take, get some provisions or just go out with a group of folks for an activity in the evenings or something like that. So you will have access to transportation while you're here. We do not have public transit here at all. And unfortunately, while the immediate area around the inn is walkable and the area around campus is walkable, everything else in between is not. And so, unfortunately, having a private vehicle is kind of necessary in this region. So we will have them accessible to you when you come. Okay. And lots of drivers if you just want somebody to drive you around. So, okay. I guess that's all I had. I'll turn it back to Sarah, wrap everything up.
Yep, that's it too. I see that James, you can still use the link to those sort of whiteboard slides where we were sharing our ideas if you still have a few things, or even if you remember after this, oh wait, there was that other topic I want to be sure gets recorded. Please feel free to add some more. But otherwise, just thank you all so much for your ideas, your conversations. I hope that your team conversations are helping you all move forward in ways that are really productive. And we look forward to continuing conversation and to seeing some of you here in a few weeks. But otherwise, just want to say thank you so much. Best wishes. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, everybody.